Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Database. Got MJ here with me today. And before we talk about the exciting topic of DB selection, vector database selection in the Azure space, there's a very exciting announcement. MJ is working on your new book at the moment. It's in pre-release for the first 4 chapters. The title of the book is Azure Database Fundamentals, and the actual publish date, I think, is in March next year. Is that right? Do you
Yes, that's
want to
correct.
tell us a little bit about the
Yeah.
book?
Yeah, thanks, David. Yep. So, yeah, again, very excited with this book, right? The title is Azure Data Fundamentals. So it's not just about database, actually, David. So, the thing is, um, within the whole data sphere, right? Like it's a bit confusing because there's just so many, you know, approach, so many tools out there, different technologies, and they're kind of, moving so fast. It gets pretty overwhelming. And even if you are working within the Azure space, Azure space itself, like there are so many options as well. It's not like you just have to. It's not like 1990s when you talk about Microsoft, it's just SQL Server, right? Like there's so many data options out there already. And this book is something that kind of like supplements the DP 900 certification exam, which is the Azure Data Fundamentals. But it's not just an exam guide. It's also like a really gentle introduction of these different services or different data services out there, so that you have a really good understanding or good fundamentals before you go into things like AI, machine learning, or RAG patterns, and things that we're actively talking about, right? And like if
Yeah.
you need a resource that, hey, I'm just moving to IT or I'm just moving to data for the first time, I need a good resource to give me a solid introduction, solid fundamentals.
Well, I
And
think
that's
even
what the
for
book
people
is.
who's worked on a particular type of database or technology in the past and now want to kind of understand like what the broader picture look like, that sounds like a really good
Exactly. Yeah,
source
yeah.
as well, right?
Yeah. So the book is kind of like divided into 4 parts. Like the first one is like a introductory about data itself, like the whole landscape, like you know, um and things like that. Like what are the different professions around data sphere. And then the second one would be talking more about structured or like things like SQL, MySQL, Postgres, and then the third part would be more on unstructured or like things like Cosmos DB, Redis, AI search. Actually, it's in there as well. And lastly, on the part 4 would be more around the analytics side. Talk about Power BI, Fabric, Data Factory, and things like that. And then there will be that bonus chapter later on around AI or the whole Azure OpenAI Sphere Gen AI Sphere. So again, I'm very excited. I've been like spending a lot of time writing this book, like drafting this. Like yeah, it's actually even harder now because there's again this space is moving so fast. It's hard to keep up, but I guess that I'm still sticking to the motto of the book of like getting to the basics, getting the fundamentals right. Yeah.
But that's super exciting. I have a lot of respect for you on finding the time to actually write the book as well. So it's no, it's amazing. Yeah, definitely looking forward to it and all the best. We'll post a link. So
Yeah.
if you want to get a taste on the first few chapters, yeah, just click the link and it will take you to the pre-release version of the book. All right,
Awesome.
okay. Last night, actually, I attended an AI event, and there's different people talking about different projects that they've been working on. It's quite interesting because I haven't attended any events for a little like AI type of events for a little while. Like there's clearly like people still talking about the more machine learning traditional models, and then there is like the how some of the people actually use ChatGPT large language models, and there's kind of like a big challenge in the actual deployment for both. Right? Like, a lot of the things looks great on paper, looks great in demo, but clearly, like the fact that none of them has actually went into production for it, it kind of indicates the big challenge over there, which makes I think today's topic quite relevant because the devil is in the detail here. Like we've been talking about, all these different different type of technology, different variation of configuration. And today we want to talk a little bit further. Well, you will be talking a little bit further about the detailed options in the Azure space. So I'm definitely looking forward
Yeah,
to.
yeah, absolutely right, David. And again, like I mentioned earlier, right? Like it's not the 90s anymore. It's not like choosing, Oracle versus SQL Server, or is it IBM DB2 or MySQL and stuff like that, right? Like, um, and this is not just in data; it's also in web technologies, mobile technologies, everywhere, right? Like it's just like so many options out there. Um, so I think then there's also this concept of the whole concept of like technology gravity. Um, so like the thing is, when you learn a technology, right, somehow you're always grounded to that technology. So let's say you've spent 10 years in SQL Server, and you're always gonna think everything can be done in SQL Server. Like some of the NoSQL capabilities, some of this capabilities like new things like vectors and stuff like that can be done in SQL Server. Right? Even the application logic can be done in SQL Server with stored procedures and stuff like that. Again, there's that concept, right? Like that grounding, um, that gravity, that when you're in that sphere, you get that, right? Like same goes with Power BI, right? Like when you're in the Power BI world, like you prefer to do the DAX queries and that kind of like data flows. Like you don't usually go approach with things like Synapse pipelines or data engineering Spark notebooks straight away, right? Like you don't think of it that way.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Well, classic case is all the Excel users out there.
exactly, right? Like
Yeah.
so that's why if you can do things in Excel, you'll just stick to Excel. Um, but in terms of like like probably four categories I can think of. All right. In where this is how you probably want to decide. First is like the unstructured one. The reason why I want to focus first in unstructured, because like we've come to a point now where data is like data storage is actually cheap. You don't have to kind of like be sensitive. Oh, I have 2 GB of data, and like things like that. It's not that much of a deal anymore. It's like um 2 GB is just tiny bit now, right? And also because we have so many different data types out there, we don't have to conform into tables. Like we do have images, we do have videos, obviously sounds, um, other raw format out there, um, and so when you think of it that way, like where do you actually store that, right? Like that's like the primary use case for things like Azure storage, right? Like Azure storage, the blob containers in general. That's like the prime candidate for that. It's a robust, cheap, and it supports any unstructured data, right? Like it's just like your file explorer in Windows or on Mac, right? So for any unstructured data, you probably want to use a blob storage. And within the blob storage itself, like there's so many different types and options out there. We're not gonna go into deep to that, but like any kind of like form factor, blob storage is the way to go. Now, still part of unstructured or semi-structured. Now this comes a question of like, hey, how about things like Parquet, Delta Parquet, Avro, CSVs, right? Now within Azure Storage itself, there is a option called ADLS Gen 2, which is Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. So that it supports that hierarchical namespacing, it supports that kind of like, like configuration, so that the storage itself supports this kind of like big data file format, right? So if your use case again is still on that, like this massive like Parquets and stuff, still within Azure Storage, but you need to take the data lake ADLS Gen 2 capability. Arguably, obviously, when you go to that territory, you're still talking about Azure platform. But if you want to go to the non-Azure platform, like something like SaaS-based offering, that's where Fabric comes in. With OneLake, right? So OneLake within Fabric is the way to go when you want to load these Parquet files. Like, they're just kind of like unstructured in nature or semi-structured in nature, but they're still tables, right? So that's why if it's in a raw form, something like data lake storage is the way to go. But if it's say you want to derive insight in there straight away, then OneLake is probably a good place to put this. And at the end of the day, OneLake is the evolution of ADLS Gen 2 anyway, but like in a shared governance model. Now, so that's unstructured. Now let's go to things like semi-structured. So with semi-structured, this is like a place where things like JSON files or unstructured or like schemaless or no SQL-ish type of data type. Believe it or not, there's actually a lot of options out there as well. So the first option, it's the primary option is the Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL API. So again, remember within Cosmos DB itself, there are actually multiple APIs. Like within Cosmos DB, there is the NoSQL, which is like the primary, I guess the like the Microsoft own flavor of NoSQL, and then there's MongoDB within Cosmos DB as well, and then there's Gremlin, there's Cassandra, and so on and so forth, right? Now this is where it gets really interesting or territorial, because with things like unstructured, like if you like depends on the use case. Most of the time, a Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL can cater most of the use case, right? But like there are reasons you might want to use like MongoDB for things like there's a huge community out there, and it's kind of like platform agnostic, so you're not tightly connected to Azure. So and then the other bit as well is that MongoDB itself within Azure, there's a Cosmos DB version, and then there's the MongoDB Atlas version, which is like managed by MongoDB people, but just hosted on Azure. So again, more options out there, right? And even so, right, like with unstructured things like Redis is also a form of a unstructured kind of like data store, which is caching, memory, stuff like that. And even things like AI search, because you're wherever you put in your vectors, embeddings and stuff like that. For me, I still classify that under semi-structured. It's not highly structured yet. Yeah, so I guess in a nutshell, you might want to use AI search if you're again trying to do the whole searchability aspect or like retrieving information aspect, like the whole concept of indexing. And now with Azure OpenAI, it's kind of like becoming the bridge to any of these data services anyway. Like you can have a PDF in Azure storage, then use AI search to index them and then serve them to Azure OpenAI. But yeah, like the thing is, things like Redis is still primarily used for something that's like fast throughput. Like you never persist them because it's always like just up there, like in memory, like always being used. There are arguments that Redis can be a primary database nowadays, but I haven't come to that conclusion yet, and I haven't been exposed to that yet to come to that judgment. That's why for me, if I'm working on Azure projects, like .NET projects in particular, I prefer to use the NoSQL Azure Cosmos DB because of the API support and a lot of like the toolings in place and integrations within Azure itself. Like with Fabric, like Fabric and Azure Cosmos DB has this mirroring capabilities and stuff like that. Yeah, so that's the semi-structured. The third one is structured and something familiar to most people. Like the options are obviously Azure SQL, SQL Server, that whole SQL family. Then there's Postgres, then there's MySQL, then there's other SQL-ish type of database. I guess the easiest answer I can think of at the moment is Azure SQL itself. Like SQL on its own, it's so powerful. Like it can do a lot of things already. But comparing Azure SQL to Cosmos DB, I would still use Cosmos DB for any transactional application heavy database, because requirements change all the time, and like that means that you might want to make sure you're not dependent to the database people saying, all right, we need to change this schema first before you change a feature in your application. So that's why in that regards, I still prefer to go to the NoSQL approach. But the Azure SQL approach is something that's much more structured. Like you've kind of like defined already that these are all the columns, and it's very unlikely going to change. And then you just need to make sure it's fast, it's robust, it's highly scalable, and so on and so forth, right? And the question of Azure SQL versus Postgres, on the other hand, is more around like a very religious point of view, right? Like Because for the 99% of the use case, they can do the same thing. But the remaining 1% would be things like Postgres is open source. Postgres has this extension. Postgres has this, like capability, some GIS capability out there that's already open source. And Azure SQL is things like, oh, I already have a lot of my entity framework code in there, scaffolded in there, and so on and so forth. And I came from a SQL Server background, and I just want to migrate that workload. And again, it's for the 99% of the use case, like SQL, Postgres, and MySQL can kind of like cater most of it already. Then you get to that 1% of like, how do you scale? How do you index? How do you do this, and that? And it's just, again, preference. Right. Now, the fourth category would be, something we've been talking about, which is like you're choosing your vector database. Which again, at the moment, right, like so many options even within Azure, but I'm probably just drilling down into two, I guess, main options at the moment, or maybe three. So option number one is AI search still, because it's very, heavy on GUI. Like it's very, all the workflows are in there already. Like you want to ingest data from an Azure storage or Cosmos DB. And even now, it also supports Fabric. So AI search now supports ingestion from Fabric OneLake. So that's really awesome, right? Again, AI search is still acting as that bridge to an LLM application or that Gen AI application, so that you don't have to do the heavy lifting of migrating and stuff for you. Like your transactional database or whatever data form you have still remain as it is, and AI search is like that bridge that like connects that together. And one of the downside that I can only think of with AI search is the cost associated with it. It's but even the search aspect of itself, regardless if it's vector or non-vector, there's already cost associated with that because you're trying to make sure data is accessible fast when you're performing really advanced search. Now, the second recommendation is that was recently announced is um, Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL. Um, one, it they came up with this new algorithm, the SKN algorithm, that allows you to really make embeddings accessible fast, like really fast. And this technology is actually what powers the whole GPTs within the ChatGPT app, so that it it caters that capability of scale, right? So something that requires fast and instant vector stuff, like this is the technology to use for. AI search is something like a final form, like you've came up with a final form, now you want to bridge that final form into your AI app. This one, the Cosmos DB, something like I'm still working on it, like I'm actively using it. That's what it's going to be used for. And then the third category is Postgres, which is the open source version, right? Like again, if you don't want to be locked in within the whole Azure ecosystem, Postgres has this awesome extension called pgvector, which supports a lot of those fast algorithms out there as well, HSNW. And the whole extension, the whole community loves Postgres. So maybe Postgres is still a good, like vector database. So those are the four kind of like main classification at the moment of these data stores, like unstructured, semi-structured, or schema-less, then structured, which supports schema, and then vector database. So there you go. Like that's my whole take around this feature.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. That's actually a lot of information to actually download. And it might like I think when it comes to you are business, you trying to make certain decisions. Like you need to understand all the different segments. Like what's my application in this particular segment? What data do I have in like what unstructured data do I have? How do I use them? But once you understand your requirements and based on your current state, like I still feel that there's actually not that many options that you can choose from. Like if you're already using MongoDB, obviously just stick with MongoDB there. If you're already using Postgres, just stick with Postgres. If a lot of data is in SQL, just continue to use SQL. There are definitely new capabilities around the vector DB side of things. But I think the good thing with Fabric now is that being like increasingly capable platform. There's so many different connectors, and then like anything can also connect back to it. There's API capabilities, and it is mirroring with Cosmos DB, and like it also felt like, well, that Microsoft is trying to simplify a lot of these things for its users
Exactly.
as well. But one thing you also touched on towards the end is the costing side of things. Like,
Yeah.
while there's so many different options, nothing is really free, and I think
There
this
is a
could
free one.
end up being
Cosmos DB has free tiers, so that's one reason to use Cosmos DB as well. So like
yeah,
literally,
yeah.
like in Cosmos DB, there's an actual like permanently free stuff, free tier. Like you don't have to pay anything. But then once you reach the limit, like obviously, you're hitting that threshold, right?
Yeah. Like once people start using the way that the data can potentially grow, whether inside the organization or if you're looking at taking external data, I think it can quite easily exceed that
Yeah.
kind of threshold.
And probably blob storage is still like the cheapest of this all, right? Like again, because it's just like storing things, it's just storing files. That's why, if you come to think of it, if you're really, really, really concerned about some of the costs associated with things, like you can just use Azure storage for everything. It has support for blobs, it supports stable, it supports so many things.
I think, yeah, but also the other side of this is just the fact that even if you're gonna mix it up, right? I want to use MongoDB for the vector. I want to use Microsoft Azure SQL for my like structured data.
Yeah.
I want to use Fabric. Probably a bad example there. I want to use Data Lake for my semi-structure and unstructured use Cosmos. Like even mixing it up, like from a development perspective, is actually not that bad as well. It's not
exactly.
like it's
There's
not
no
like the old days where if you have that kind of combination, the integration is going to be such a nightmare. But now I think, yeah, it's quite
I think
manageable.
and I think because again we don't have the problem of storage cost anymore and the performance or aka scale problem that much. Like like people would think that they are Uber, but they're not Uber level of scale, right? Like you have an application that 100 or 1,000 people are using. You don't need that
Yeah,
much scale.
yeah,
So
exactly.
yeah,
Yes.
that's why we're presented with a lot of these problems has already been addressed. Now, what's the new problem? Now we introduced more choices out there. Again, it's not a religious choice anymore of like, oh, we're from Oracle, we're moving to SQL, or like we're from SQL moving to IBM. Like, yeah, it's not that kind of like
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes I kind of like maybe some people will get offended by this. Sometimes I felt like this is the Australian political parties that you need to choose, right? Whether you choose Liberal or Labor. But on majority issues, they're actually the same. Like there is a bit of a difference, but there's no real right or wrong answers as well. I think the key thing is actually not to overanalyze on like there's no best decision here. Just pick one that works, and a lot of them will work, and just pick one, and then just focus on the development or the application or the user experience side of things rather than spending too much time and effort in getting this particular decision right. It just doesn't feel like a critical decision anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it boils down to you're creating an app to serve 100 people or 10 people. Might as well put more of your effort into serving the customer, right? Rather than like
Yes.
The one of the factor in as well is that things like Cosmos DB for NoSQL, you have to factor in that you're actually learning just this particular tool within Azure and Microsoft, right? Like if you go to a different cloud, they have a different offering out there. They might be 60-70% similar, but you need to learn the 30% on what makes it a bit different. Compared to sticking to something like open source straight away, like MongoDB, it's agnostic straight away from any cloud. So yeah, I guess you just have to factor that in, and I guess that's why Postgres is also loved. Like whether you're in Azure or any other cloud out there, it's well received, right? It just works.
Yep. Sounds good. Well, thanks for that. I think it's very exciting to kind of talk about all of these options. And one thing I was talking to you before we started thinking is like, would be great actually when we actually get our hands on some practical stuff on the, especially on the vector DB side, because that's so new. Like one thing I see in my head is, okay, if I have a performance issue or a hallucination issue, then by changing the actual underlying vector DB without changing embedding method or anything, would that actually make any difference? So yeah.
Or just wait for GPT-5 and give my 10 terabytes of data and it can understand everything.
I'm trying to get people to stay focused. Stay focused. Don't worry
Yeah,
about. Don't
yeah.
listen to MJ about that GPT-5 stuff. Forget it. Forget it.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome.
All
Yeah.
right.
If you like our content, please subscribe.
Yeah,
We'll-
like and
we'll-
subscribe and put in some comments too, at whatever
Yes.
you think.
Awesome. Great. Well, see you all next time.
Yeah. Bye.